Welcome to Warsaw. Welcome to the capital of Poland. A city whose history is written not only in chronicles, but also in its streets, squares, and rebuilt townhouses. Set on the Vistula River in the heart of the country, Warsaw is now the largest city in Poland and one of the key political, cultural, and economic centers of this part of Europe. It was here, after Gniezno and Kraków, that the country's political center moved when in the late 16th century the royal court began to tie its future to Warsaw. Since then, the capital has often stood as the center of Poland's most important events, both glorious and tragic. The most dramatic chapter came during World War II. To English ears, even the name Warsaw sounds a little like Warsaw, as if history had hidden a grim prophecy in it. And Warsaw truly saw war at its worst. Destruction, occupation, the ghetto, the Warsaw Uprising, and the city's near total destruction. And yet, after the catastrophe, the capital rose from the ruins and was rebuilt with extraordinary determination. The clearest symbol of that story is the Old Town. Painstakingly reconstructed after the war, and now one of the most remarkable places in the capital. Warsaw's Old Town also became one of the most extraordinary places in Europe, and in 1980 it was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. This is where our walk begins. In the first part of the series, we'll walk through the historic heart of Warsaw, where among the walls, lanes and squares, the spirit of the old city is still alive. You can also find the route map and full walk description on our website. And if you enjoy walks like this, with history in the background, be sure to subscribe to our channel and join us for the next episodes. And now, let's head into Warsaw's Old Town. We begin our walk here in Castle Square. Beneath Sigismund's column, one of the most recognizable symbols of Warsaw. This place is no accident. For centuries, this was the route leading from Krakowskie Przedmieście to the royal castle and on into the Old Town. The present-day square was laid out only in the early 19th century, but it still preserves the memory of the old Kraków Gate and the medieval defensive walls, whose outline can still be traced even in the pattern of the paving stones. Sigismund's column itself was erected here in 1644 by order of Władysław IV, who wanted to honor his father, King Sigismund III Vasa. It was a monument unique not only in Warsaw but in all of Europe. It is considered the first modern column monument dedicated to a non-religious figure, and at the same time the oldest secular monument in the capital. The statue of the king was made by Clemente Moli of Bologna, and to this day the monument rises about 72 feet above the square. King Sigismund III Vasa is a key figure for Warsaw, because it was during his reign that the royal court moved here permanently, and Warsaw became the effective political center of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. With that rise in status, the royal castle was expanded, and the city began to grow into the modern heart of the state. At the top of the column, Sigismund is shown both as a monarch and a defender, holding a cross in one hand and a sword in the other. And that sword is tied to one of Warsaw's best-known legends. People say that if the king ever lowers his weapon, disaster will fall on the city. Warsaw residents like to recall that this dark prophecy came true in symbolic form in 1944, when the column was hit and collapsed during the war. For centuries, people have also said that Sigismund stands here not just as a monument, but as the city's guardian, someone who watches over Warsaw from above and keeps watch over its fate. It's also worth looking a little further toward the royal castle, because there you can still see fragments of the earlier column shafts. The present one is already the third, and the two older ones, the one taken down in the 19th century and the one destroyed by the Germans in 1944, have been preserved and lie nearby along the castle's southern wall. Before we walk up to the royal castle, it is worth noting that Castle Square is home not only to the castle itself, but also to the palace under the tin roof, a building more modest on the outside, yet very important in the history of this place. It is a late Baroque palace, set at the foot of the castle on its southern eastern side. It takes its name from its copper-covered roof, which was a real rarity in Warsaw and quickly became one of the residence's most distinctive features. Its final architectural form was given by Jakub Fontana, and over time the palace was incorporated into the larger royal residence complex. The story of the palace under the tin roof leads us not only into the world of architecture, but also into the very heart of Old Warsaw's political and social life. At the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was one of the best-known addresses in the city. It was home to Prince Józef Poniatowski, one of the most important figures in Polish history, a national hero, military commander, and a symbol of the Napoleonic era. This was where elite society gathered. Receptions, balls, social events, and artistic evenings were held here, and the palace gained a reputation as one of the most famous salons in the capital. In time, this place also took on political and military importance. When Prince Józef became Minister of War of the Duchy of Warsaw, the palace under the tin roof became the main headquarters of the state's army. Even Napoleon Bonaparte stayed here during his visit to Warsaw at the turn of 1806 and 1807. That is why the palace is not just a beautiful companion to the royal castle, but also a witness to an era when Warsaw was a stage for great politics, hopes of restored statehood, and the social life of the highest circles. Interestingly, the palace under the tin roof is also one of those Warsaw landmarks whose original form survived the war. Although Warsaw was devastated on a catastrophic scale, this building came through it in better condition than many of the surrounding residences. Today it belongs to the Royal Castle complex, and inside the apartment of Prince Józef Poniatowski has been recreated in an effort to restore the atmosphere of its greatest days. Now let us head to the Royal Castle, the place that for centuries was far more than just the seat of a monarch. It was here that the political heart of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth beat. The origins of the castle go back to the 14th century, when the Great Tower, today's Grodzka Tower, was built. Over time, the former ducal stronghold was expanded, and in the 16th and 17th century, especially during the reign of Sigismund III Vasa, it took on the form of a closed pentagon. From then on, it was not only a royal residence, but also the meeting place of the parliament, as well as an important administrative and cultural center of the country. That is why the royal castle holds a truly unique place in the history of Warsaw. When Sigismund III Vasa shifted the political center of the state from Kraków to Warsaw, the castle became the most important stage of public life in the Commonwealth. Later, in the 18th century, under King Stanisław August Poniatowski, the interiors were rebuilt on a grand scale, creating state apartments meant to match the rank of a modern monarchy. Here, court ceremony, art, politics, and affairs of state all came together. This place is also tied to one of the most important events in Polish history: the adoption of the Constitution of May 3rd. It was in the castle's halls, and more precisely in the Senate chamber, that the decision was made. On that still stands as a symbol of political courage and an attempt to reform the state. Because of that, the royal castle is not only an architectural landmark, but also a place of memory tied to Poland's former statehood. The fate of the royal castle, much like the fate of Warsaw itself, was dramatic. As early as September 1939, it was hit by the first bombs falling on the city, and the sentence of total destruction was carried out in September 1944. From the very first days of the war, however, a heroic rescue effort was already underway. Art historians, museum curators, and conservators, working under the direction of Professor Stanisław Lawrence, carried out and hid everything that could still be saved. Works of art, fragments of interior decor, stucco, decorative details, and furnishings. Later, when the Nazi Germans began the systematic destruction of the castle and started drilling holes in the walls for explosive charges, people were saving literally every detail they could: doors, paneling, fireplaces, wall paintings, and architectural fragments. Because of that, thousands of original elements found their way back into the interiors we see today. And the official commemoration of the reconstruction even speaks of nearly 80% of the furnishings and priceless works of art having been saved. It was on foundations like these, both material and human, that people could later begin thinking about bringing the castle back to life. The final decision to rebuild the castle was made in January 1971. And the entire project was funded through public donations, and the generosity of supporters. The work moved very quickly. By February 1973, the first topping outlet had already been raised. And in July 1974, the tower domes were put back in place. And it was then, on July 19, 1974, at 11:15 a.m., at exactly the same moment when the clock hands had stopped during the fire caused by a bomb in 1939, that the clock was started again. Today, every day at that hour, the Warsaw Bugle Call is played from the clock tower. The reconstructed interiors were opened to the public for the first time on August 31, 1984. And the castle once again became a place of living memory, open to the people of Warsaw and visitors from around the world. As we continue toward Kanonia Square, we pass Bacciarellówka House, a building very important to Warsaw's artistic history. In the second half of the 18th century, it was home to the apartment and studio of Marcello Bacciarelli, court painter to King Stanisław August. The king entrusted him not only with the role of chief court painter, but also with the ambitious task of creating the royal painting studio and helping build a modern artistic scene in Warsaw. Today, this place is known by a different name, as the Wedding Palace, one of the best-known civil registry offices in the capital. It is also worth looking up at the covered passage leading from the royal castle to St. John's Archcathedral. The cathedral, connected with the castle since the late 16th century, witnessed the most important events of state, and the passage itself was meant to give the ruler a safer way to move between the residence and the church. Its construction is linked to the attack carried out by the deranged nobleman Michał Piekarski against King Sigismund III Vasa, when the king was assaulted on his way to a service at St. John's Collegiate Church. The attacker, though clearly out of his mind, managed to wound the monarch. During the interrogation, carried out under torture, he rumbled so wildly that in Warsaw people began to say, "He raves like Piekarski under torture." After his execution, another legend grew up around this place, that at night, the spirit of the would-be killer still wanders here. Before we move on, it's worth slowing down for a moment at Gnojna Street. It runs from Kanonia to Świętojańska Street along the southern wall of St. John's Archcathedral. And its name comes from the dean's residence, which once stood in this area. It is a reminder that this part of Old Warsaw was closely tied to the church buildings of the Collegiate Church and the life of its chapter. It is here too that you can best see that Warsaw's Old Town is not just a beautiful reconstruction, but also a place of memory. Embedded in the cathedral wall on the Gnojna Street side is a fragment of the truck of a German military vehicle, one of the authentic traces of the fighting and destruction of the Warsaw Uprising. Toward the end of the war, Nazi German units destroyed the Old Town with extraordinary ferocity. Moving through the ruins were the so-called Goliaths, small unmanned vehicles that left behind mines, set to explode with a delay, adding even more destruction. One of them was meant to finish off the inside of the cathedral, but it got stuck on a pile of bricks and threw its truck. People say this is not the exact same one, but even the sight of it is enough to make the history of this place feel very real. Before we move on, let us pause for a moment by St. John's Collegiate Church. Researchers trace its origins back to the 13th century, and the first confirmed written record comes from 1339, when an important papal court case against the Teutonic Knights was held here. At the turn of the 14th and 15th century, the church was elevated to the rank of a collegiate church, one of the most important churches in the region, served by a chapter of canons. That matters all the more because we are still speaking of a time when the royal court was in Kraków and Warsaw was the center of the Duchy of Mazovia, ruled by the local Piast dynasty. That is why the growing importance of this church shows so clearly how fast Warsaw itself was growing, and how much more important a role it was beginning to play in Mazovia. Over time, St. John's Collegiate Church became one of the most important churches in the state. It was closely tied to the royal castle, and its walls witnessed coronations, royal ceremonies, and events of great political importance. It was here, after the Constitution of May 3rd was passed, that the document was sworn before the altar, giving it not only political meaning, but symbolic meaning as well. Looking at the building today, it is hard to immediately see how dramatic its history was. The church was already heavily damaged in September 1939. And during the Warsaw Uprising and after its fall, it was almost completely destroyed. After the war, it was rebuilt to a design by Jan Zachwatowicz, restoring a form inspired by Mazovian Gothic rather than the 19th century appearance it had just before the war. For centuries, the interior of the church held valuable royal foundations, as well as the tomb slab of the last dukes of Mazovia. In the crypts below rest many major figures from Polish history, including Henryk Sienkiewicz, Gabriel Narutowicz, Ignacy Paderewski, and Stanisław August Poniatowski. And right next to the Collegiate Church stands the Jesuit Church, also known as the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Grace. It is a Baroque church built from the early 17th century onward, long associated with the Jesuits and with one of Warsaw's most important Marian devotions, because it is here that the image of Our Lady of Grace, patroness of Warsaw, is especially venerated. The Jesuits remained here for more than 150 years, until the order was suppressed. Later, the church passed through the hands of different religious communities, and in 1834 it was taken over by the Piarists, who had been expelled by the Russian authorities from Długa Street. They brought their furnishings here, and with them came the sculpture of the bear. And that stone bear became the hero of one of Warsaw's legends. It tells of a wealthy but very unattractive prince who one day saw the woman he loved leaving the church, already beside her newly wedded husband. Heartbroken, he is said to have run out of the city, howling in pain like a bear, until at last he turned into one himself. At night he returned to the church, lay down by its doors and turned to stone, waiting for the one person he would love him and break the spell. Carved in 1764 by Jan Jerzy Plersz, the bear is said to be waiting here to this day. In 1907 the church returned to the Jesuits, and it remains in their hands to this day. It is also worth noticing its remarkable entrance, the bronze doors designed by Igor Mitoraj. They were installed in 2009 on the 400th anniversary of the church. They are meant to recall the suffering of war and to symbolically evoke the wounds of the Warsaw Uprising. And now, let us return to Kanonia Street, behind St. John's Collegiate Church. This is one of the most charming and atmospheric corners of Warsaw's Old Town. The name itself recalls the canons who from the 15th century on lived in the houses surrounding the former church cemetery beside St. John's. For many years, Kanonia served precisely as the parish cemetery. In time, however, it became clear that a burial ground in the very heart of the city was too small, and that continuing to bury the dead in densely built-up Warsaw helped diseases spread. So in the 18th century, 3 nearby parishes pooled their funds and bought land outside the city, in the village of Wąski. That was the beginning of the place we know today as one of the most important and remarkable cemeteries in Poland. Of the old cemetery by the cathedral, only one clear trace remains: the figure of the Virgin Mary standing behind the church, once a cemetery tombstone. Kanonia is also known for its famous bell. It was made in 1646, and its maker was the same craftsman who created the statue of Sigismund III Vasa for Sigismund's column. The bell was originally meant to go to Jarosław, but it never reached its destination. Years later it was found in a scrapyard in Podolia and was bought back by the National Museum. Since 1972, it has stood right here, and over time it has become one of the best-known symbols of Kanonia. A legend has grown up around it as well, one that says that the bell grants wishes. In the simplest version, all you have to do is touch it and make a wish. But many people say you must also walk all the way around it, without taking your hand off the bronze. And only then does your wish have a chance of coming true. Right next to the bell, there is one more Kanonia curiosity worth noticing: the extremely narrow townhouse at number 2022. From the front, it looks almost like an architectural joke. Its facade is only one window wide, and is considered the narrowest townhouse facade in Poland, and sometimes described as one of the narrowest in Europe. There is also an old city tale tied to this place, saying that this shape was a clever way to pay less tax, since taxes were once based on the width of the facade. Now we head on toward Gnojna Góra. Following Piwna Street, one of the most charming and atmospheric lanes in Warsaw's Old Town, whose very name points back to a former passage that existed here from the late 16th century. Gnojna Góra is a place that surprises us not only with its view, but with its name as well. Today it is a peaceful lookout terrace with a view over the Vistula River and Praga, full of light and open air. But for centuries this was the place where waste and refuse from Old Warsaw were dumped. So in a sense, you could say this hill was built up by human hands. Only in the 18th century was the practice banned, the slope covered with earth, and the former dump gradually began to turn into a place much friendlier to the city. On Gnojna Góra stands the sculpture The Strong Man, a bold, slightly rebellious accent in this setting. It is a work by Stanisław Jackowski from 1908. For years the sculpture remained almost hidden from the people of Warsaw, and only in 2004 was it moved here, to this terrace above the city. It is also worth noticing the townhouse at 5/9 Brzozowa Street, because this is where the remains of the old Gnojna Gate have survived. For centuries, this was the gate through which trash was taken out beyond the city walls. The gate itself was built in the late 14th century, and its remains still adjoin the townhouse today, reminding us of a less elegant but very real side of Old Warsaw. Near the entrance to the terrace, you can even see bullet marks from World War II. When the gate was demolished in the 19th century, the old street known as Gnojna or Gnojowa was renamed Celna after the nearby customs house. And if you look through the gate toward the buildings on Celna Street, you can spot another interesting detail. It is the relief Mazowia from 1966 by Edmund Majkowski, showing the Mazovian Duke Janusz I the Elder leading his knights to Grunwald. We continue a little farther along Brzozowa Street. It is worth noticing the houses here, because some of them grew out of old granaries from the time when the Vistula ran much closer to the escarpment. The most interesting of them is the building at number 12, known as the Professor's House. The former Strubicz granary was rebuilt around 1920 into housing for the faculty of the University of Warsaw, and during the Warsaw Uprising it became one of the strongholds in the defense of the Old Town. It is also from Brzozowa Street that you enter the Heritage Interpretation Center, a branch of the Museum of Warsaw, which helps visitors better understand the history and transformation of this part of the Old Town. Now we turn left onto Kamienne Schodki, Stone Step Street. Today made up mostly of steps, though in the past it followed a more even path toward the Vistula or the Market Square. It was an old route to a gate in the defensive walls, and at the same time a way down to the river, from where residents carried water back into the city. Following Kamienne Schodki, we reach the top of the market square, but instead of going straight into its center, we turn right onto Krzywe Koło Street, and we'll come back to the market square in a moment. Krzywe Koło is one of the most famous little streets in the Old Town, above all because of the legend of the basilisk, the monster said to turn people to stone with a single glance. The name of the street is no accident either. Its curves, bends and curves around the backs of the market square houses. So for centuries it was associated with something crooked, twisted, not quite regular, a truly crooked circle. This brings us to the city walls. It is here that you can best see that Warsaw once had its own defensive system, later strengthened by the Barbican and the new town gate. Today you can pass along the walls either below or above, but whichever route you choose, we continue on toward the Barbican. The Barbican is one of the most recognizable parts of Warsaw's old fortifications. It was built in 1548 to a design by Giovanni Battista of Venice as an outer line of the city's defenses. Just in front of it once stood the new town gate, reached by a drawbridge. The passage itself was well protected, with the portcullis, heavy oak gates, and guard rooms above. Interestingly, even when it was built, the Barbican was already a little outdated. The development of artillery quickly reduced the value of fortifications like this. In fact, it played a major military role only once, and rather ironically, more against the Poles than in their defense. That happened during the Swedish Deluge, when on June 30, 1656, the forces of King John Casimir recaptured it from the Swedes. Later, its importance gradually faded. In the 18th century, the Barbican was partly dismantled, and in the 19th century its remains were absorbed into a row of townhouses built on this spot. The first step toward restoring the old line of the walls came even before the war. In 1937 and 1938, under the direction of Jan Zachwatowicz, a section of the walls was uncovered and the western part of the Barbican Bridge was reconstructed. After the war, however, the future of this place was far from certain. The communist authorities wanted to remove what was left of the old fortifications. But Professor Zachwatowicz, who was overseeing the reconstruction of Old Warsaw, reacted very clearly. He is said to have pointed out that removing those walls would open up the view of the churches, something the party would rather avoid. Thanks to that, the Barbican survived. During the post-war rebuilding, the decision was made not to restore the latter buildings, but instead to expose the old fortifications and reconstruct the Barbican itself. Today we see it as one of the most recognizable symbols of Warsaw's rebuilt Old Town. And right beside it stands the Powder Tower, where gunpowder was once stored for the guards, watching over this part of the walls. And we keep going. Along the way we pass the statue of a knight, which fittingly leads us toward Rycerska, or Knight Street. This small monument is a sign of Old Warsaw, a city of walls, gates, guards and defenders, where for centuries people had to watch over the safety of its residents. And the knight reminds us of the time when this part of Warsaw was a true stronghold. Following Rycerska Street, we arrive at the little insurgent monument, one of the most moving places in the Old Town. It is a small statue of a boy in an oversized helmet and a loose uniform, carrying a weapon that seems almost too heavy for his narrow shoulders. The monument was created by Jerzy Januszkiewicz and unveiled in 1983. It does not tell the story of one specific child, but of all the youngest participants in the war and the Warsaw Uprising who were forced to grow up far too soon. It is a small statue, but immense in meaning. a reminder not only of heroism, but also of the price an entire generation had to pay. From the little insurgent monument, we continue along Wąski Dunaj Street and then come out onto Szeroki Dunaj. The name may sound a little surprising, since it has nothing to do with the great European river, the Danube. But in Old Polish the word Dunaj simply meant a stream or water course. It was here that a small branch of water once flowed, feeding the moat that surrounded the walls of Old Warsaw. Over time, the old streams were diverted into underground channels, and the well in Szeroki Dunaj Square is one of the few reminders of that part of the area history. Let us pause for a moment here on Szeroki Dunaj. From 1631 on, there was a fish market here, selling herring and other salted fish, because the trade in fresh fish was reserved for the market women in the Old Town Market Square. On the eastern side were the stalls of shoemakers, so even then this was a place strongly tied to the trade and craft. Now look at the townhouse number 5. This was the home of Jan Kiliński, the famous Warsaw shoemaker, who during the Kościuszko uprising stood at the head of the people of the capital and led them into battle in 1794. He was not only a craftsman, but also one of the most vivid figures of Old Warsaw. His monument stands not far from here. That is Kiliński, with his sword raised high. The monument itself, in fact, has a rather unusual story of its own. It was unveiled in 1936 in Krasiński Square. But during the German occupation, the monument was taken down in retaliation after resistant members removed a German plaque from the Copernicus monument. The statue ended up in the National Museum, where the Warsaw Underground later found it. And on the museum wall there appeared a famous and slightly defiant line: "People of Warsaw, here I am, Jan Kiliński." After the war, the monument returned for a time to Krasiński Square, and only in 1959 was it finally moved to Podwale, where it still stands today. So this is not only a monument to a hero, but also one of the most well-traveled monuments in Warsaw. Now let us return to Szeroki Dunaj. Look up at the townhouse number 13, the so-called executioner's house, once the seat of the Guild of Various Crafts. There we can see another Warsaw mermaid, a ceramic relief made in 1963 by Henryk Gaczyński. This is a good moment to notice that the mermaid in Warsaw has many faces. She appears in coats of arms, on facades, in decorations, and in monuments, and her image has changed over the centuries. From an older, more fantastical creature, almost dragon bird-like, to the figure we know today, half woman, half fish, with sword and shield, the symbol and guardian of the city. And with that in mind, we can move naturally into the Old Town Market Square, because that is where Warsaw's most famous mermaid is waiting for us. Its model was created by Konstanty Hegel in 1855, and the sculpture was placed in the middle of the square as the centerpiece of a fountain, connected with the launch of Warsaw's first modern waterworks. And this is the Old Market Square, the true heart of Old Warsaw. It was laid out when the city was founded, at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. At first there were around 40 wooden houses here, and the center of the square was filled with market stalls, butcher stands, and the city scales. Over time, and also after repeated fires, the wooden buildings gave way to brick townhouses. And an address on the square became a sign of prestige. This is where the richest merchants and wealthiest townspeople of Old Warsaw lived. This place was not only a market, but also a stage for city life. During the Enlightenment, it also played an important political role, but at the beginning of the 19th century, it began to lose importance. The city government moved to the new town hall at the theater square. The old town hall was demolished, and the center of big city life was shifting further and further beyond the old town. But today's market square is both very old and very new. In 1944, its buildings were almost completely destroyed, and what we see today is the result of the great post-war reconstruction. Since 1916, each side of the square has had its own patron. The southern side is named for Ignacy Wysogota Zakrzewski, the western for Hugo Kołłątaj, the northern for Jan Deckert, and the eastern for Franciszek Bars. These names are no accident. All of them point to important figures connected with Warsaw's burghers and the era of major reforms at the end of the 18th century. But the best way to get to know the square is not by its names, but by its houses. Just look around and you can see that every facade has a character of its own. Some are narrow and tall, others wider and more elaborate, with decorations, painted details, and old house signs. On the Zakrzewski side, number 5 stands out, the former house under the basilisk. The name immediately brings to mind one of Warsaw's best-known legends, though it is worth adding that this does not mean the basilisk was believed to live right here. The name of the house refers more to the famous Under the Basilisk restaurant, which for years reinforced that association and became part of the old town's atmosphere. On the corner house at number 13 in turn, you'll see the figure of a lion, which gave the building its name, House Under the Lion. Signs and emblems like these were once very important. They helped people recognize buildings long before modern street numbers were introduced, and at the same time gave each house its own identity. When we look further along the Kołłątaj side, the first interesting townhouse appears right on the corner. The former Kranichowska house, also known as the Simonetti house. After the war, it was rebuilt for the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, and to this day it still houses a post office. On its corner, one detail stands out: the large clock, a gift from Warsaw's Guild of Clockmakers to the rebuilding Old Town. At numbers 21 and 21A, we can see the house of Hugo Kołłątaj himself, one of the most important figures of the Polish Enlightenment. A priest, writer, reformer, and co-author of the Constitution of May 3rd. Another notable one is the Fukier house, for centuries connected with the wine trade and with one of the most famous burgher families of Old Warsaw. And at the end of this site, one more building catches the eye: the House of Saint Anne, once also known as the House of the Mazovian Dukes. It takes its name from the 16th century figure, of Saint Anne with Mary and the Child, placed in the corner niche of the house. On the northern Deckard side, the main presence today is the Museum of Warsaw, whose headquarters stretch across as many as 11 historic townhouses around the square. One of the best known is the house under the moor, number 36, whose name comes from the decorative hat that had adorned its facade since the 17th century. At the end of this side of the square stands the house under Fortuna, one of those old town buildings whose name grew directly out of its facade decoration. In this case, the figure of Fortuna, added after a 17th century rebuilding. On the bar's side, in turn, we find, among other things, townhouses connected with the Adam Mickiewicz Museum of Literature. Now we leave the square and head toward Piwna Street, another characteristic street of the Old Town. Already at numbers 45 and 47, the Magyar house catches the eye. Linked to Antoni Magyar, a physicist, astronomer, meteorologist, and memorist, one of the more fascinating figures of Old Warsaw. It was here that he carried out his observations and made him such an exceptional chronicler of the city's everyday life. A little further on, at number 31/33, is the Pharmacy Museum, a reminder of the world of old apothecaries, medicines, and Warsaw pharmacists. At number 25 stands the so-called Porter's House, whose name refers to Mikołaj Narewski, porter to Prince Karol Ferdynand Waza. In the post-war years, Bronisław Geremek lived here for nearly half a century, a distinguished historian of the Middle Ages, one of the most important figures in Poland's democratic opposition, and later the country's foreign minister. A little further on stands the house under the Eye of the Providence, its name taken from the old emblem once placed on the facade. Then we come to a place of special importance, the former Hospital of the Holy Spirit and St. Martin's Church, one of the oldest churches in Old Warsaw, built around 1356 and for centuries connected with the Augustinians. It was here that the regional assemblies of Mazovia were once held, so the church played an important role not only in the religious life of the city, but in its public life as well. And at the end, it is worth noticing the house at number 6, decorated with sculpted doves. This is not just a decoration, but also a moving reminder of a woman who, after the war, refused to leave the ruins of her home and stayed here despite the destruction, becoming one of the symbols of post-war Warsaw, stubborn, faithful, and deeply tied to its place. This is where we end our walk through the Old Town, Warsaw's Old Town. Brought back to life from the ruins after the war through the immense work and faith of people like Professor Jan Zachwatowicz. Today he is remembered by a modest monument near Castle Square, standing a little in the shadow of the townhouses, as if quietly and proudly looking out over his city. Thank you for walking with us. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and come back for the next episode, because next time we will set out along krakowskie przedmieście.